Hey, Dog Nation, my name is Brandon Adams, and welcome to DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Excited about today's show for a couple of reasons, because as we begin on air today, we also kick off our DawgNation Days of Summer countdown. In fact, if you go to DawgNation.com right now, you'll see the link to the two big events on June the 13th there at Callaway Resort and Gardens, on August the 1st, right there at beautiful Brasstown Valley Resort. You can go to DawgNation.com right now and kind of click in there and see more about these two great events, including right now, you can book your rooms to be a part of these big events with us. I'm going to tell you in just a moment about why that is crucial to do that now while there's an opportunity to be a part of a special VIP situation that we're going to have going on there. So we'll talk more about that coming up in a moment. Also on Tuesday, it's Jeff Sintel, UGA recruiting talk with him. A lot of stuff to get into yesterday with Mr. Sintel, including something he wrote yesterday at DawgNation.com by Jay Hardy, a defensive lineman. That's a position that Georgia needs, and Georgia may have a special inroad to getting in with Hardy. We'll talk about that. And, of course, off the top of the program, a lot on Georgia and Oklahoma, a non-conference series that I think should be fun for UGA fans for more reasons than one. In fact, we'll get into that right now as DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
It would be unusual for me to ever tell my audience, video, podcast, radio, everything in between, that they should do something other than give their full attention to the show. After all, I like to think that folks enjoy our conversation, and I like to have this vision in my mind of everybody being really plugged in to every word we discuss around here, all the UGA football news and UGA athletics news that we kind of distribute over the course of this show. You'd like to think that you have a captive audience for that. But today, I would suggest it's okay to be not maybe quite as captive. If you're watching the show on video, maybe you have another browser up on your device. If you're listening to this on the radio, maybe you pull out your phone for kind of a second screen experience. Podcast, kind of everything else, too, very much the same way. Because as I'm speaking right now live, just after 10 a.m. on this Tuesday morning, if you go to DawgNation.com right now, and I think you should go to DawgNation.com right now, you will see a link right up there at the very top of the page to find out more information about our DawgNation Days of Summer. Now, I told you yesterday about why I think this is going to be the most fun summer we've had around DawgNation, and I also told you yesterday that today would be the day you could start booking your room. So right now, if you go to DawgNation.com, you can get in on that. Your chance to be with us on June the 13th, which is really going to be here before you know it, at Callaway Resort and Gardens, and then with us again on August the 1st at Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. Now, the reason why you want to act fast on this, as I explained yesterday, the first 20 rooms booked at Callaway for June 13th and at Brasstown for August 1st, those first 20 rooms booked are going to make you eligible for a very special VIP experience. We're going to have a regular event at both these places that starts at 6 p.m. A lot of Georgia football talk, a lot of the stuff we've done in Atlanta we'll be doing outside the city of Atlanta at both Callaway Resort and Gardens and Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. We'll be doing that there starting at 6 p.m., but a special VIP experience and a whole lot of good stuff going along with that VIP opportunity for the first 20 rooms booked at both locations. So please go to DawgNation.com. You can find out more about these great facilities. You can find out more about this awesome, awesome event, and you can start booking your room right now. Because after all, who doesn't need a great excuse for a summer getaway? And DawgNation's giving you that with our DawgNation Days of Summer. Really excited about seeing all of you at these great events this summer. Now, with that said, speaking of travel, Georgia's got some more travel planned coming up in the years ahead, and I think this is really fun. Georgia announcing a home-and-home series with the Oklahoma Sooners. And really, I think that, and I know there's going to be some pushback from Georgia fans of, well, another example, at least in the return date for Georgia getting the home game back against Oklahoma, that's not scheduled to happen until a long time in the future, and I get that. And there's a little bit of pushback about the fact that almost all of these homes and home that Georgia has scheduled with these Power 5 opponents, they almost all include a road trip for Georgia first and then a return home date after that. In the case of the Georgia-Oklahoma return date, as I said, it's many years in the future. I get that there's some pushback on all of that. And yet, even with that said, I think that the addition of the Oklahoma series to go along with everything else that Georgia has added here recently, I think this is something that's really fun for fans, and I think this is something that UGA fans ought to celebrate. First of all, the number one reason why is because when we first started talking about Georgia versus Texas or Georgia versus Clemson or Georgia versus Florida State, all of these upgraded schedules and tougher non-conference opponents, all of that started to seem and feel very distant in the future, kind of a long time from now. Well, all of a sudden, you blink your eyes, and some of this stuff kind of doesn't quite seem so far away anymore. In fact, with the addition of Oklahoma, you start to see a little bit of a connection between the non-conference schedules in future years, where all of a sudden you can just about guarantee yourself every year going forward that Georgia's going to have a non-conference Power 5 opponent other than Georgia Tech on its schedule. In fact, if you're watching on video, I'll show you some of the evidence on this. Next season, Georgia plays Virginia and Atlanta. May not seem like a great game, but it's better than McNeese State or something like that. In 2021, there's not one of those kinds of games. But then watch this. Then in 2022, it's Oregon and Atlanta. That could be a very fun game. 2023, the one that Georgia just added at Oklahoma. Then 2024, it's Clemson in Atlanta. 2025, Georgia back in Pasadena to take on UCLA. The following season, 2026, UCLA comes to Athens. Then it's at Florida State in 2027. Both Texas and Florida State in 2028. Both Clemson and Texas in 2029. Then it's Clemson again at 2030. Oklahoma coming to Athens in 2031. It's a Clemson game again in 2032. And then the Dogs are back at Death Valley to take on Clemson again in 2033. That's essentially every year but one, 2021 and future years, as far as we can kind of think and see into the future, where Georgia is, assuming the scheduling model stays consistent with what it is right now, taking on another Power 5 non-conference opponent other than Georgia Tech. It's a massive scheduling upgrade, and by adding Oklahoma into that 2023 year, all of a sudden, as I said before, this is not some distant future thing. This is something that starts to feel like right now, beginning next year in Atlanta against Virginia, however good or not the Wahoos end up being. But this is kind of a little more present tense now than it seemed before just by adding Oklahoma. I think that's a really good thing. The other thing about this rivalry that I think, or I should say this series between Georgia and Oklahoma, that I think is going to be really fun for fans in particular, is the fact that it does, I think, have the potential of feeling a bit like a rivalry by the time 2031 or 2023 rolls around. And that's assuming, of course, that Kirby Smart stays at Georgia and Lincoln Riley stays at Oklahoma. I mean, right now, Georgia and Oklahoma don't necessarily feel that way, and maybe some people don't necessarily put Kirby Smart and Lincoln Riley in the same sentence when it comes to contemporaries. Some people think that Smart's rival is probably more like Nick Saban, the coach that he used to work for and the coach that he's obviously emulated a lot of from a style standpoint from what he learned at Alabama, bringing that over to Georgia, or kind of a deep South next-door neighbor like Dabo Swinney. But the truth is, both those coaches had been coaches for a long time before Kirby Smart became a head coach. And in the case of Nick Saban, he is, as I've said before, more in the winter of his career. There's a very good chance in the next few years Saban's not coaching at Alabama at all anymore. But the coach that kind of probably feels a little bit more like Kirby Smart may be someone like Lincoln Riley. Also a coach relatively new into his career and almost like the opposite side of the same coin. Kirby Smart has made his bones as a coach by being innovative with defense and being committed to a tough, hard-nosed brand of football. Lincoln Riley, on the other hand, has made his bones as a coach by being the flashiest offensive coach, arguably, in college football. And, these two coaches who've kind of grown up at the same time, it was the head-to-head meeting at the Rose Bowl at the end of the 2017 season, and then Oklahoma getting into the playoff over Georgia last season that have kind of put Lincoln Riley and Kirby Smart into the same discussion, maybe more so than some people realize. That these two relatively similar coaches in terms of the trajectory of their career, by the time 2023 rolls around, we could add a few more chapters into the lore of which of these two guys is the better coach and who's doing the better job of using his style of play as the style of play that could be dominating college football in that given year. And in fact, anytime you think about big-time Big 12-style offensive coach versus power football, defensive-minded SEC coach, there's always going to be a little extra pizzazz added to that rivalry because the two styles of football are so different. The two brands of football are so different. It was not too long ago, a year ago or so, that Lincoln Riley kind of talked about that. Talked about the way that his offense and the Big 12 offensive work, and that they're going to have an opportunity to score a whole bunch of points, even against some of these SEC defenses like Kirby Smart. Made some Georgia fans mad at the time, but it does add to a little bit of what might actually end up being a Lincoln Riley, Kirby Smart coaching rivalry. Here's what Riley said last year.
What's different here is you're facing those offenses every single week. You just don't have that in any other league. Not that you don't have good offense in other leagues, of course you do, but you just don't have the consistency and just the challenge week in and week out that you do in this league. I mean, the Rose Bowl is a perfect example. Nobody all year could move the ball on Georgia, and we had a pretty nice run in that game offensively. And you've seen that in a lot of the. A lot of people had trouble moving the ball against Ohio State last year. And you've seen that a lot in these non-conference games, these matchups where all of a sudden these really good defenses are giving up that everybody thinks for this or that, are giving up a lot of points to Big 12 teams. So it is a challenge. We did have some excellent defenses in this league last year. Iowa State, TCU, some of those guys were some of the top-ranked defenses, no doubt. But you go throw Georgia's defense, which was a top 5 ranked defense going into the Rose Bowl. You go throw them in the Big 12 every year. They're not going to be a top 5 defense. I mean, it's just probably not going to happen. And so, the challenges that you face, the style of offenses that you face is definitely a little bit different. But again, I think it's league-wise, again, if you watch kind of where the NFL's headed and kind of where our league's been, I think it's very, very close, very similar to so many of those teams. And I think there's a lot of teams in this league that are on the rise, too. So it's an exciting time for our conference.
I mean, it's really the age-old debate of how would an SEC defense do against Big 12 offenses every single week? How would a Big 12 offense do against SEC defenses each and every week? And when Georgia and Oklahoma play like they did in the Rose Bowl, that's going to come up. And in 2023 and then in 2031, that kind of stuff, the contrast and the styles of play is going to come up as well. And then one more quick final point on this. The third reason why I think Georgia-Oklahoma is really fun for fans is it's another example of what I believe Kirby Smart and Georgia doing, leading the way, ushering in this brand new era of scheduling in college football. There's no doubt that Georgia's been the most aggressive of any of the major Power 5 opponents about scheduling better games in the upcoming years to go along with what is already a tough SEC schedule and a permanent non-conference opponent like Georgia Tech. Georgia still wants more on top of that. Georgia fans ought to take a sense of pride in knowing it's the Dogs leading the way on this, and Kirby Smart also talked about that as recently as a couple of weeks ago.
I'm thinking that to get in the playoffs, as the future goes, I don't know whether they'll ever expand it. That's not for me to even kind of divulge on. But I do think that you're going to need a quality of schedule to do that. I think that there's going to be 2-loss teams in the future. If they've got a really tough schedule, that'll be able to make that. I also think at the University of Georgia, you should be able to recruit the finest, best players in the country out of your own state and across the country because our academic institution is so highly thought of. So I want to have the best players. I want to play the best teams. Kids come to college to play big games. They don't come to play, I would never name anybody, but they don't come to play anybody, the Sisters of the Poor. They want to play the best teams. So we want to go schedule the best teams. Unfortunately, you can't schedule these games but 7 to 10 years out. And that's so frustrating to me because I can't think about 7 to 10 years out. I'm trying to think about tomorrow and this year, and you're having to schedule way in advance. But we thought 3 Power 5 opponents, non-conference, would be not groundbreaking, but we thought it would be a new thing, and we're not afraid of that. I'm not afraid to go out and play. I mean, you look at the NFL teams, and I know those are different players, but they play 16 teams in a season that are all good. There's no cupcake in the NFL. They play back-to-back-to-back quality opponents, and we want our fan base to get that. We also want our fan base to get potentially what might be 7 consecutive home games, non-conference Power 5 opponent. And we're trying to get that lined up for them and play some good rivalries. I think it's going to help us in recruiting. I always do. And I like playing in Atlanta as well.
So listen, the overall bottom line for me is you hear Kirby Smart lament the frustration of 7 to 10 years you have to wait on these games. And initially that was kind of true. It's not quite 7 to 10 years anymore. 2023 is going to be here before you know it. Upgraded Georgia schedules are essentially here now. And it's a great chance for Georgia and its style of play to go out there and measure itself against the very best in the country. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you, live on video, 10 a.m., Dog Nation Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Radio at Noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and as a podcast wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. As I said off the top of the program, don't forget you can go to DawgNation.com right now and start registering to join us for Dog Nation Days of Summer in June. On June the 13th at Callaway Resort and Gardens, on August the 1st at Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. DawgNation.com, the place to go to find out more about that right now. We'll get Jeff Sintel here coming up in just a moment. It's a Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update Tuesday for us on our program. A lot of recruiting news we'll get from Mr. Sintel. Before we get to that, though, I did want to talk a little more football because on yesterday's program I talked about a surprising potential first-round pick for Georgia in 2020. It was Georgia safety Richard LeCounte, and over the course of our conversation I explained why maybe when you look a little more deeply at LeCounte, he's actually played a little better than maybe some Georgia fans may have given him credit for this most recent season. Well, another day and another potential surprising name mentioned as a possible first-round pick. Not surprising because he hasn't been a good player. He's been a very good player for Georgia last season, but maybe just a level of attention we haven't seen this young man get as of yet. I'm talking about wide receiver J.J. Holloman. Now, Holloman was not mentioned in Sports Illustrated's most recent 2020 mock draft, but he did get some consideration as a possible first-round pick. Let me show you what the writer Eric Single says about Holloman as a potential guy who could leave as a junior and enter the first round of next year's draft. He says there's more speculation behind this one than the others, meaning he's less sure Holloman can truly become a first-round pick, but Single writes, Holloman is crazy athletic and could be a fast riser as Fromm looks for trusted targets after losing his top 3 receivers from 2018. Now, when it comes to Holloman's athleticism, when I think of that, I think of his leaping ability. I think of his ability to go and get the ball out of the sky. He's great at high-pointing those balls. But it's really that trusted target phrase that may mean the most here. That speaks to the kind of guy that you can depend on week after week after week. And that's one of the things that Kirby Smart talked about with Holloman after G-Day, a game admittedly that probably wasn't Holloman's best. It seems like at times Eric Stokes may have gotten the best of their one-on-one matchup, and yet it's a part of another spring for Holloman where he added to that trusted target status. In fact, there was one word that Smart used a lot to describe Holloman. Could it make him a first-round pick? Well, listen to Kirby and decide for yourself.
JJ's had a very consistent spring. He's physical, competitive. He runs the stop routes real well. He's made a couple really good plays on the deep ball in some other practices. Today, he had a little slow start there getting started with the offense, but he's a model of consistency. He's got really strong hands and does some nice things.
Yeah, so listen, I think that's great to see. And as we said yesterday about Richard LeCounte and J.J. Holloman, a lot of these 2017 signees starting to get some draft attention. Some of them may truly build on that and actually work their way into the first round of next year's draft. And so a lot of them are going to have their opportunity to do that. It'll certainly make the 2019 season a whole lot of fun to watch. And no doubt J.J. Holloman is a big part of that Georgia offensive plan. Before we talk to Jeff Sintel, let me also remind you that this week some great opportunities to save at Kroger. You can get 2 times the fuel points on Thursday through Sunday on select items when you download the coupon from the Kroger app. It's perfect timing for many of you who are traveling to see your mom this weekend for Mother's Day, or you got Memorial Day plans or something like that. 2 times the fuel points Thursday through Sunday. That runs through May 26th, so make sure you take advantage of that at your local Kroger. It's good to have you here on Dog Nation Daily. We got a lot of fun stuff coming up on our program today. We will talk later on about another big get for the Georgia basketball program. Tom Crean with a major recruiting win there. But here on this Tuesday, always a great chance to talk some football recruiting. We'll do that with Jeff Sintel right now. It's great to have you on the program.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Credit to Connor Riley. Y'all can't see this. Connor's our producer here, and he's running to do the phone. He's kind of doing the one-man band thing on the other side of the glass today. So he's doing the phone. He's playing the music. He's keeping the video going. That is a lot of juggling for one thing at one time, and I appreciate him helping keep us on the air on Dog Nation Daily today for our video, radio, and podcast audience. I also appreciate our next guest. He is, of course, our recruiting insider around here, and he gives you the inside scoop on UGA recruiting each and every week. His twist on things, I like to say. But when you want chef-inspired food with a twist, that's Marlowe's Tavern. Y'all know we love that around here, and we love them providing the Marlowe's Insider Update to us on Dog Nation Daily each and every Tuesday, which means Jeff Sintel. Jeff, Thanks for your time. We appreciate you being with us, and we hope you're doing well.
Hey, Brandon, I'm great. Hope everybody in the nation and on Twitter and on YouTube and on Facebook are having themselves a splendid morning so far.
So let's talk about Jay Hardy for a moment, Jeff. I liked your piece on him at DawgNation.com yesterday. I think Hardy is now more important for UGA for reasons that we will get into in a moment. But the thing that I really liked about your angle on Hardy yesterday was the obvious chance that Georgia may have an ally in that recruitment. Now, I appreciate the fact that you pointed out that, listen, these high school teammates playing together in college or 7-on-7 teammates or guys who just become good friends at these camps, these package deals, so to speak, have a way of fizzling over time when you're old and gray like me. That's just something that you notice on the recruiting trail. And yet, you cite some evidence that suggests that Zion Logue, who played the same school that Jay Hardy goes to, the 2019 signee for Georgia, that he and Hardy have maybe a little deeper connection than that. How beneficial to Georgia is Logue going to be in Jay Hardy's recruitment?
Well, they're actually AAU teammates that go to different schools in Tennessee, but they grew up basketball players, which I think is very funny for the athlete that Georgia is now recruiting for its defensive line. You know, Jay Hardy was a guy that played first base growing up, and then he's hit 7 3-pointers in an AAU game, and he's hit 4 3-pointers in a varsity game. And yet this young man is 6'5" and about 275, and is rated among the nation's top 5 defensive ends. So Zion and him have a kinship, and they've been friends for a long while. And Zion's going to Georgia, and when Jay Hardy visits Georgia, Zion will be a natural host. He'll be able to kind of bond and click and everything else with him. And that's already a leg up on a recruiting process when Georgia already has a host, so to speak, that knows the young man well and knows where he came from and knows what he likes. And he can kind of give him the real when it comes to how the playing fit would be there at Georgia. You know, the other thing is, that all sounds really well and good in textbook and all. But then I just watched them at a camp over the weekend, and those two were side by side. They were looking at each other's phones. They were laughing. They were pointing out the same things. The same cliques of guys would come up and talk to them, and they just seemed like easy, lifelong friends. And I think in the long run, I think this could help Georgia more than most.
Yeah, I think the other thing about Hardy that I think is really interesting, this is something you and I talk about a lot. You mentioned that weight, already 270 pounds as a rising senior. I think about a guy that in a college program is going to add even more weight than that. And so it seems like to me, like a lot of these guys kind of listed by the recruiting services, sort of that strong side defensive end, that big defensive end. But I think of those guys kind of transitioning to more of a inside player, at least on a lot of downs for Georgia in the future, almost like what Brian Brzee could have been had he chosen UGA over Clemson. Am I on the right track with the player comp there for Hardy, that this is one of those guys? Kirby says he's looking for athletic defensive tackles. A big defensive end in high school kind of grows into an athletic defensive tackle at the SEC level. Is that kind of the way that you see Hardy as a player?
Yeah, Brandon, I've got a metric. The young man better be special, like Brian Brzee special. When you're over 270 pounds in high school, and you're playing defensive end or playing out on the edge or the perimeter, your body's only going to get bigger. You're only going to get bigger. The good weight's only going to come on to you. That's going to be about 20, 25 pounds in college. And if you're 270, you'll end up 290, 300 in college. And it's almost like at any level of football. Great tight ends become tackles. Great offensive tackles become offensive guards. Great defensive ends become defensive tackles. You got to be really special to operate out of there on those edges. And, Brzee is maybe the lone exception to that rule we've all seen lately after he just smoked a 4.13 short shuttle at the opening up there in D.C. And, folks, that's wide receiver fast in that pro agility drill.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do think it's relatively interesting. You talk about the Bill Nortons and the Zion Logues, the Timon Mitchells from last year's class, the potential of a guy like Jay Hardy in this year's class. It's kind of interesting that Georgia has made these inroads in Tennessee. Jeff, as you know, the overall talent level in that state seems to be improving. Now, I don't know that it's improving dramatically, and I think there's still some work to be done to put that state on par with some of the other southern states as far as really producing top-flight college talent. But it's interesting that Georgia's success in recruiting the state of Tennessee would certainly seem to coincide with an era in which Tennessee's producing more of those four-star level SEC caliber players than certainly I think the state produced a few years ago.
Yeah, it's funny, Brandon. It seems like right now, whether it's Trey Scott or the Georgia way, but kind of like Idaho is known for its potatoes and Florida is known for its oranges. It seems like Tennessee right now, in terms of Georgia's eyes, is known for its defensive linemen. The Bulldogs are recruiting heavily in that area, and they're doing very well, probably because Tennessee is a little amiss right now. But there's a lot of things with Hardy that just stick out to me as a kind of a pure athlete, and that's really what you want. I noted the basketball stuff, but he's also comes from a very prestigious school in Tennessee, the Macaulay School. That's an all-boys school where he's very focused on football. And this is a young man. I think Georgia's going to kind of hang around through a lot of cut-downs with him when it comes to his final decisions.
It's our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update with Jeff Sintel. He gives us the inside scoop on UGA recruiting each week. But if you want inside information about the tavern right there in your neighborhood, including big events or special offers, maybe the next time DawgNation's going to be on hand, become a Marlowe's Insider by texting the word Marlowe's, M-A-R-L-O-W-S. That's M-A-R-L-O-W-S to 24242. You can find out about all the things happening at the tavern right there in your neighborhood. All right, Jeff. The reason why the Jay Hardy recruitment may be more important for Georgia and players like Hardy, which we'll get to momentarily, is because of another piece of bad news and another sense of finality with a recruit that at one point in time we talked about a lot. So Miles Murphy comes out and announces that he's getting ready to make his decision, and on his Twitter feed he includes Clemson, he includes Auburn, doesn't say anything about Georgia whatsoever. So you have an in-state prospect from Powder Springs, and I get the whole position fit thing, and we've been down that road a million times. But it is a little bit of a kick in the gut for a lot of UGA fans that for a player of Murphy's caliber in a state like Georgia, area in Powder Springs, which the Dogs historically have, at least recently, have done pretty well, not to make the final two for Murphy is a little bit of a stinging blow, Jeff, if you don't mind me being very candid for a moment. What do you make of that?
Well, we've kind of been kicking the tires on that one for a few weeks, Brandon. If you follow Before the Hedges, the signs to me basically pointed to that after the Atlanta opening, when he was talking about he was deeply invested in the academic architecture of both Auburn and Clemson, and yet he hadn't really checked out the academic fit yet at Georgia, and yet his mother was an alum, and he said he'd have to get back to Georgia to do that on his next visit. Well, to me, that's just a clear indication of the real stakeholders in Murphy's decision. I think you use the term toe tag a lot on our Hedges program, which airs Wednesdays on Facebook and YouTube. And he's been drifting off of our top targets list for a while. And you know, with Murphy, this is just another example. I think we basically populated what Georgia's biggest recruiting areas or biggest recruiting zones are going to be for the 2020 cycle. It was the DMV fishing hole, and it was the kind of Cobb County fishing hole a little bit right there. And right now, Dabo Sweeney's got his, I guess, custom-made rod with national championship bling on it. He's reeling in something, a pretty special prospect, another special prospect from Cobb County in Miles Murphy. That's what it seems like to me. And should Clemson keep building, everybody's seen DJ Ungale, and they've seen DeMarcus Bowman, they've seen Brian Brzee. I think when it's all said and done, Brandon, I think Clemson might end up with 10 of the nation's top 50 players for the 2020 class.
Which is good for them, I guess. And you're right when it comes to Murphy that it's not a surprise that he's not going to choose Georgia. It's not a surprise that he's going to choose Clemson. But I don't know. Maybe I'm making too much out of the symbolic nature of this. But to not even have your hat on the table, to me, feels like a little bit of a, I don't know. It feels like a pretty big disappointment, Jeff.
Well, we've talked about position fit. We've talked about 4-3 versus 3-4. We bring up a lot of reasons or triage here on this one, Brandon, how Georgia currently has about 5 outside linebackers that look like that Roger Goodell will eventually call their name really early in a draft. The other thing to think about here, Brandon, is Georgia has had its ace recruiter, Dell McGee, on Miles Murphy in its recruitment for quite some time, as well as its outside linebacker coach and Dan Lanning and other guys. Georgia has put the A1A personnel on it, and sometimes, Brandon, the heart wants what the heart wants, and Miles Murphy is going to be a very good one for the Tigers, whether it is going to be purple and orange or navy and orange at Auburn.
Last thing for me on this subject, and I'll admit this is sour grapes, but I'm here for all the 4-3 versus 3-4 talk. I'm fine with that. when we veer into the conversation about academics, Auburn especially, if you're going to tell me Auburn academics, that's like saying you're looking forward to going to Norman, Oklahoma in 2023 for all of its five-star restaurants. That's at least my take on that.
Yeah, but I think one point that I think our readers and viewers and listeners need to pay attention to is Georgia's academics are what they are, and they're rated really highly, top 20 school, top 15 school. I think it's 13th in the latest U.S. News and World Report rankings. But that new engineering school is a relative, newborn in terms of all those rankings. It's growing, it's expanding, it's bringing in a couple of elite recruits that did so in the 2019 class. But right now, that engineering school rating also needs to get a little bit higher to impress a lot of those recruits. Now, not saying Auburn and Clemson's are top 10 and top 15 or anything like that, but that's another area where the growing engineering school can really help Georgia in the future.
Let me talk about another one of these kind of strong side defensive end, athletic type guys, and this may be a false positive. Honestly, it probably is, but I'm sure you saw where Javon Dexter, the Florida commit, recently tweeted a picture of himself wearing a Georgia uniform on a recent Georgia visit. And yesterday, Jeff, I brought this up mostly to kind of have fun at the expense of Florida fans, just because I love watching the way they are just absolutely beside themselves in worry after DeMarcus Bowman leaves the state to go to Clemson, and kind of some of the other fears that have been recently struck in the hearts of Florida fans about the state of Dan Mullen's recruiting process. But on the Georgia side of this for a moment, if a Dog fan's looking for some of those athletic defensive lineman type guys, Dexter certainly has the look of one of those, but how serious should a UGA fan take the possibility that Dexter would land somewhere else other than the University of Florida?
Well, Brandon, let's put it like this. I would say the chances of Dexter continue to grow, but you want to talk about busting sour grapes or maybe rattling the cage of Florida fans, which I guess you do enjoy doing. I think Bowman was a dagger to Florida recruiting, but should Georgia pull Gervon Dexter away from Florida, that would be kind of like Georgia losing 2 Miles Murphys to Clemson. That is a guy that probably should never leave Florida. He's confessed on Twitter. He's been a Florida guy for forever. That he wants that to be his school. If we want to kind of parallel it even further, it would kind of be like an 11th hour flip of Richard LeCount maybe in the 2017 class from Georgia. Those sort of things don't happen at Georgia, but those sort of things seem like they are still susceptible to happening in Florida.
Yeah, exactly right. And I wish that I didn't enjoy this kind of, I think the fancy word is schadenfreude. I wish I didn't enjoy that quite as much, but when Dexter tweeted what he tweeted, I loved looking at all the responses from the Florida fans. And listen, I don't condone anybody tweeting anything at a recruit. I think it's best just to leave all that stuff alone, period. But you knew Florida fans were going to be in there with their heart palpitations and everything else, and you definitely saw that. And as we've said before, it's one of the reasons why I think that Dan Mullen is, at this point in time, an overrated coach, because it does seem questionable whether he can hold on to a prospect like Dexter. Could not throw the kitchen sink at a guy like Bowman, the running back, who's now on his way to Clemson. These are things that Dan Mullen at Florida right now are just not very good at doing, and it's one of the reasons why Georgia needs to take advantage of this opportunity while Florida is not raking in the talent the way we become used to the Gators doing that for years and years and years. Let me do one more thing, Jeff, before we let you go. A linebacker, a position that, as you said before, Georgia is in the business of doing really well with. Well, Trenton Simpson comes out with his list of finalists. UGA gets included in that conversation. If I remember correctly from the picture, didn't Georgia get the full helmet on this, the jerseys? We've seen this edit before where it's like a portion of the various uniforms kind of partitioned off, but Georgia got the helmet for Simpson. I don't know if that means anything or not, but we talked about Simpson briefly this past week on Before the Edges. So I guess kind of the latest on that and how big of a deal it is to see UGA included among the list of finalists.
Yeah, the geography of that edit was very interesting. I noted on our forum, Brandon, that I think Miami had basically his belly button part of the jersey, and Auburn had the pants. Tennessee had a sleeve, and North Carolina had a sleeve, and Georgia had the helmet and headgear, the full headgear.
Yeah.
I tell you, Trenton Simpson.
Miami being close to the midsection seems about right.
You use the big words today, man. Like they belong out of a shot. They belong out of a Quentin Tarantino script, and now you go with a little saber rattling to Miami. But the thing there with Simpson is, I spoke to him maybe 45 days ago, and he felt that Georgia was in there, but they were outside the orbit of the core schools. And yet, man, over the last 2 or 3 weeks, Georgia has shot up into his leaderboard. He had a great visit to G-Day. He really likes how Georgia has viewed him as an inside linebacker. And for Georgia, in this class, folks need to know that they've obviously checked a lot of boxes with guys like Channing Tindall, Nakobe Dean, Quay Walker, Monty Rice. They got Tay Crowder in the fold as well for this season. Georgia has stacked up a load of inside backers, not to mention Rian Davis and Trezman Marshall. I only think they take 2 in this class, and it's going to be interesting which 2 that is. Is it a guy like Justin Flo who has all the rankings, but maybe and maybe is not the athlete that a Trenton Simpson is or a Lynette Whitehead is as well? That's going to be very interesting about how many linebackers, especially inside linebackers, Georgia will take in the 2020 class. Simpson right now, folks, is right there in the midst of it, among the top choices for Georgia.
Good stuff from Jeff Sintel. We always get his twist on UGA recruiting here on the Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update, but when you want chef-inspired food with the twist, you want to check out Marlowe's Tavern. Become a Marlowe's Insider by texting the word Marlowe's, MARLOWS, 24242. You can find out about a lot of really fun things, including special menu items and all kinds of stuff happening in the tavern right there in your neighborhood. What a great time. It's patio season right now. There's so many great Marlowe's Taverns patios that we enjoy kind of hanging out and having a little craft cocktail or some really good food. It's just springtime is a great time to get over to the Marlowe's Tavern closest to you. So find out more about that. Jeff, thanks for sharing a little recruiting insight with us. We appreciate you being a part of the program, and I will see you right here in our DawgNation World Headquarters studios tomorrow afternoon for Before the Hedges, and we'll talk even more about this 2020 class as it continues to come together.
All right, guys, have yourself a good week. See everybody tomorrow.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
All right, really fun to have Jeff Sintel on the program, like getting that recruiting insight from him. And as I said yesterday, for the people who are just joining us, I know many of you radio-wise or video-wise, you start the show a little later. Don't forget, today is the big day that if you go to DawgNation.com, the links there for our DawgNation Days of Summer, the big event starting June 13th, at Callaway Resort and Gardens, and then on August 1st at Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. You can get in and register for your rooms right now, and the reason why you want to act right now on that is the first 20 to do so. First 20 rooms booked at either location qualifies you for a special VIP experience. That's an hour earlier than the regular event that starts at 6. We'll have a VIP experience starting at 5 and a whole lot of fun and add-ons to go with that. DawgNation Days of Summer are going to be a blast. It's not just for us to celebrate, it's for you to celebrate with us. We'll escape from Atlanta, enjoy a little summer getaway, some great weather, some great times, whole lot of fun. Cannot wait to see you for DawgNation Days of Summer. Before we do our SEC through, let me also remind you very quickly that our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia, that is a group you want to have on your mind this time of year, because when you're taking stock of your house, a lot of you do spring cleaning this time of year. You may notice a crack in your foundation or some sort of like wet spot, something like that. And my advice to you is act fast to get that fixed and taken care of, and trust experts. Jeff was talking about engineers a moment ago. Well, Engineered Solutions of Georgia has a full-time engineer on staff. You want smart people, experts doing this kind of work to your house, so give them a call at 678-ESOG now. That's 678-ESOG now. All right, kind of an interesting story to start our SEC through off with today. Mike Lombardi is a former NFL executive of some note. I don't exactly know what his job when he worked in the league was, but he's been kind of a media guy now for a while. Now, Lombardi actually worked for the Browns not too long ago, so I know he was with them for a while, but he's been kind of more of a media figure probably for the last 7 or 8 years. A lot of podcasts, a lot of things like that. Lombardi is a pretty outspoken guy when it comes to the NFL. Recently wrote a book, I want to say, so he's been kind of a guy that's been out there a lot. And he was on a podcast not too long ago talking about how difficult it was to evaluate Jarrett Stidham as a quarterback at the NFL level because of how bad Gus Malzahn's offense is at Auburn. Now, listen, you talk about enjoying it, having a good time with that. Georgia fans love the idea of hearing somebody criticizing the Gus Malzahn offense and saying it's not very good for evaluating quarterbacks. Now, Tommy Tuberville, the ex-Auburn coach, was on a sports radio station in Alabama this week kind of pushing back on that, saying, hey, there's a lot you don't understand about that. Malzahn's had trouble holding on to his quarterback's coach, and kind of on it goes, which I would suggest to Coach Tuberville, who's obviously trying to play the role of good statesman. He's running for Senate, I guess, in Alabama, or governor or something like that. So he's got to try to keep in good grace with the Auburn fans. He wants to be the gracious ex-coach defending Malzahn. The reason why Malzahn has had trouble holding on to quarterbacks coaches is because they've chosen to leave under their own volition because they're essentially privates in Malzahn's army. Malzahn is the guy that wants full control of that offense. Therefore, Rhett Lashley didn't want to stick around. He and Chip Lindsey did not seem to get along very much either. But now, let's find out. Is Malzahn, in this year coming up in 2019, which is so crucial for the future of his coaching career at Auburn, is he the kind of guy that can develop a quarterback? Is he the kind of guy that can build an offense? He's calling the plays again, and he's going to get a chance to pick which quarterback he wants. The athlete from a couple classes ago, Joey Gatewood, the fresh face, incoming freshman Bo Nix. Take this young man, develop him, and cultivate him into something, or I think Auburn fans are going to say, move on, take your buyout, all this money that we've chosen to give you, and move on. I honestly can't tell you if the Auburn offense is good at developing quarterbacks or not. Other than Cam Newton, I think you're struggling to find a quarterback that it has developed, and obviously a lot of Auburn fans are seemingly frustrated that Malzahn wants to inject himself so much into that offense. That's one of the crucial storylines to watch for Auburn this season. Another SEC story I wanted to mention, this also involves quarterbacks. Barton Simmons, who you may know as a recruiting figure, he works for 24/7 Sports. He wrote a piece at CBSSports.com this week that I thought was really interesting. He was talking about quarterback succession plans. And he was mentioning the programs that kind of have the best setup for that right now. And he mentioned the situation in Oklahoma, for instance, and some others. But he also mentioned the South Carolina situation as well, because as it stands right now, they've got Jake Bentley, who's the presumed starter for this season, with Ryan Helinski waiting the wings after him on that, and then a 2020 commit on board as well. And certainly there is a positive way of looking at this for South Carolina, saying for a program and that's really been Muschamp's only problem since becoming a head coach, is developing that quarterback. Never had that at Florida. It's the reason why he got fired. Well, maybe now he's got a full plan for quarterbacks in place. But I wonder how true that really is. Maybe I'm just being too negative, but I'm not even so sure that Jake Bentley's going to be able to hold on to that job for the entirety of the season. At one point in time, there was some talk about Daquan Joyner. Maybe now all the talk is about Helinski. But let's say that Helinski eventually beats out Bentley for that job in what's supposed to be Bentley's big year. At that point in time, is any 2020 quarterback going to want to follow and come to South Carolina knowing that Helinski's got a grip on this job for the next 2 years? That's essentially the situation that all college programs are dealing with right now, Georgia to a certain extent included, and I'm not so sure South Carolina is going to be any different. It may be that over the course of this year, it's not about the quarterback succession plan, but about the fact that the future is now for the Gamecocks at quarterback. It may be Helinski more so than Bentley, and that may happen sooner rather than later. One more quick quarterback point I want to make. I mentioned the SI mock draft, Eric Single, the writer. It included J.J. Holloman as a potential first-round pick a moment ago, and I think that's kind of interesting. Something else about this draft that I also thought was interesting. This is the first one that I have seen that did not have Tua Tagovailoa. I want to say maybe number 1 overall. Single, writing for Sports Illustrated, only had Tua going number 9 overall. Actually, Jake Fromm in this draft going ahead of him. Now, this is one person's opinion, but I'm curious to see over the course of time how much this grows. All of these guys will be poked and prodded and kind of picked on and picked at as we head towards next spring. But Single was really the first guy on a major national level, writing for Sports Illustrated, kind of qualifies in that regard, to point out the fact that Tagovailoa has not played as well against top-flight defenses. Against Mississippi State last year and LSU last year, against Georgia last year, those games in which Tua was playing against the best defenses that he's seen, the stats for Tua went way down. Now, the optimistic appraisal, if you're an Alabama fan of that, is, yeah, but he was also dealing with an injury at that point in time, and maybe that's the reason why the stats weren't as good as they were. Maybe that's the case. But I think moving into this season, I do think that Tua's got more to prove against the best defenses that he plays against, and I think that's one of the things that's going to make Tua versus Fromm and all the other top quarterbacks in college football, SEC included, kind of fun to watch. Quick final thing, Michael Petway, the guy for Arkansas last year, a receiver that actually put up some pretty good numbers, transferred out of the program. He announced that he's now on his way to Iowa State. This one to me just seems weird. I don't know much about this situation. I don't know why Petway wanted to leave as a grad transfer, but it seems like Arkansas as a program, at least down the lower tier of the SEC, is somewhat on the rise. I think that Chad Morris had a pretty good recruiting class, and I think there's maybe a little more optimism this year. Morris is obviously an offensive-minded coach, but apparently Petway thinks that Ames, Iowa is the best place to finish his playing career, so he is on his way out of Fayetteville. He'll head to Iowa State. That's one of the rare times that Iowa State gets mentioned on DawgNation Daily. We'll make that your SEC through. Let me also, before I congratulate the Georgia basketball team on a great recruiting win, remind you about Merriweather and Tharp. Listen, divorce is one of those things that people don't like to talk about, and it's one of those things you hope never happens to you. In fact, most people assume it never will happen to you. But if it does, you're going to be left with a lot of questions. And when you have big questions about an important topic, it's important to get expert advice about those questions. That's why you want to trust my friends at Merriweather and Tharp. In fact, go find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com. The website, once again, theatlantadivorceteam.com. Those questions, that uncertainty, you will get that satisfied by having a consultation with them. So please go to theatlantadivorceteam.com. You can find out more about that. All right, really quickly, how about Georgia basketball adding another top 100 recruit to its most recent signing class, Severe Wheeler at point guard. Speaking of Iowa State, I guess Wheeler also chose Georgia over the Cyclones. This is the second point guard Georgia's added recently as well. Also added the transfer from Northeastern recently as well. When you think about, kind of a pass-first point guard kind of going along with what Georgia's going to have with Anthony Edwards. I know Chip Towers got a piece up at DawgNation.com about the future of Nick Claxton and all this as well. Imagine what could happen for Georgia if Claxton says, hey, they're building something pretty good at Georgia. Maybe I want to be a part of that. It is pretty clear that Tom Crean came to Georgia with a vision for what this program could be, and he's really executing that right now. I think this is an exciting time to be a Georgia basketball fan. I don't know how good they're going to be this year. I'm not quite sure how much of a difference a collection of freshmen can make, even a group as impressive as this. But there's no doubt the arrow is pointed up for Georgia basketball right now, and there's no doubt that Crean, to this point, is really doing at Georgia what he promised he would do. Remember before Crean kind of officially landed on the job here, back on the PMT, Pardon My Take podcast, Crean was a friend of those guys, and he really, at that time, expressed a real energy about getting back to coaching and handpicking the place he wanted to come. And what Crean said then, it seems really prophetic based on what's happening now. Here's Crean before he took the UGA job.
I want to coach. I want to coach. I want to go to a championship capacity type program. We built one up at Marquette. The build up here was incredible, in the sense of what it had to become. And the one thing I think I've shown myself some grit myself, because the one thing with what happened to us, with having the job taken from us like that, I've never let it get in and take my nerve or create doubt that can't do this at the highest level. And I want to do that again.
Yeah, so I think that's great stuff from Tom Crean, saying that he had the energy to coach, wanted to be a part of a program that he thought could win. And for a lot of Georgia fans, I don't know that there was a great belief that Georgia could win and win with recruits, win on the court the way that Crean seemingly believes that they can and believed that they could before he took the job. And yet he's making that dream right now seem like a reality. And there's still obviously a need to go out and win with the recruits that you're bringing in. I won't deny that's true, that the next step is obviously the hardest, but you can't get to that next step without winning with these recruits right now. It is really, really something to see Georgia, long an afterthought for any major player, all of a sudden seemingly in the mix with a lot for this class, including obviously the centerpiece of it all, Anthony Edwards, which when he leaves to go to the NBA draft could be one of the top 2, top 3 players taken. This is a big-time player, but you got to have big-time talent around those players, and Crean's doing that. By the way, on this program, we love being a Gator hater and our Gator hater updater. It's now been 920 days since Florida's beaten Georgia. That's good news. We'll see you tomorrow here on DawgNation Daily. And on video, time now for our R.S. Andrews cool down as we take your questions and comments about anything you want to discuss. And I'll remind you that my friends at R.S. Andrews, air, heating, plumbing, electric, well, they just take good care of you. So please check them out online at rsandrews.com. It may be that you have a system that needs fixing. Well, they can fix it for you. Or you need a system, and these things have a shelf life. They break down eventually. Maybe yours has breathed its last breath. Well, if that's the case and it's time to make a replacement, well, R.S. Andrews is a great choice for that as well. rsandrews.com. Hope to see many of you join us for our DawgNation Days of Summer. Excited about that coming up. Hope plenty of you are there and a part of that with us. It's just going to be a fun time to hang out. It's a relaxed atmosphere. What a good time it's going to be. So hope many of you can join us for that. And speaking of relaxed atmospheres and a good time hanging out, let's dive into some of our comments and get some of that right now. Drew Roman says Anthony Edwards to the Hawks next year is the missing piece. Yeah, maybe the Hawks have a better track record of drafting Georgia players. Obviously, they took Dominique Wilkins. I know a lot of you say the Falcons don't do enough of a good job taking UGA football players. Maybe the Hawks will do better taking the Georgia basketball players. That wouldn't be bad. Montez Cole says if anyone missed the UGA spring game or wants to rewatch it, it's coming up on the SEC network right now. Montez, thanks for that piece of, broadcast information. I'm glad to know that. Thank you for sharing that with us. Nick Lurch says, love that we have these dog days. We have so many. Yeah, looking forward to the dog days of summer too, Nick. Thanks for that. Matt Rukavine also says that Kevin Durant loses the Rockets, goes to the Atlanta Hawks next year. So maybe Durant being built around these young guys the Atlanta's bringing in. I wouldn't mind it. I wouldn't mind that at all. Wouldn't mind that whatsoever. Santiago Diarn also says we need a center and a power forward who's taller than 6'6". Make it happen, Tom. And I do get that, the need to add to that front court for Georgia. I guess for me, one of the things I got so tired of during the Mark Fox era and the brief moments we talked about basketball in this program, I would bring this up, is the way that Mark Fox, who always had pretty good collection of front court players, seemingly used them all at the same time to clog up the lane. There was no penetration area. There was no room to get to the front of the rim for the ball handlers. Could not stand that. Seemingly, Georgia always played with that kind of at least what you call two in. In other words, if you look inside the lane, there are always at least two players standing in there. In a day and age with college basketball is no more than one person in the lane on offense. Some offenses are built to work with five guys outside the lane. Georgia almost always had at least two, and that really is hard to establish a free-flowing brand of basketball with that kind of three-out, two-in look that seemed to be favored by Mark Fox. And then when you add a ball screen to that, all of a sudden you got three guys offensively essentially standing in front of the guy that's dribbling, and that was just a tough flow. That was a tough thing to watch. And so in addition to the success that Green's having in recruiting, I think he runs a more aesthetically pleasing brand of offense, which I think is good for UGA basketball. What else we got going on here? Doug Rayburn says, beat Florida in football, baseball, and basketball. Life is good, and that is indeed good. No doubt about that. Steve Schaffini on the subject of the NBA says, the Hawks and Knicks have been saving salary cap money for 20 years. LeBron's not going to walk through that door. I saw, and I'll promise I'll do 9 seconds worth of NBA. I did see where the Knicks for next year are like 16-1 to win the NBA championship because, as Steve said, another off season of people thinking some big-time players going there. On the subject of defensive line recruiting, Ro Hawkins says, BA, do you think any other defensive lineman might decommit? And is it possible for the Dogs to look in the portal for a defensive lineman? I think that's interesting. In terms of needing a defensive lineman for this year, hopefully that's not quite the case for Georgia. Between the guys who've been injured, Julian Rochester coming back, between some of the freshmen, especially like a guy like Timon Mitchell, maybe supplementing what Jordan Davis does as a nose guard, I hope that Georgia has enough bodies for that right now. Would Kirby Smart be on the lookout for something? Maybe so. As far as the decommitment goes, obviously the name that comes to mind here first and foremost, whether it be a possibility or not, is Jervin Dexter, the current Florida commit, who we talked about with Jeff a moment ago and on our program a little earlier this week, who tweeted about Georgia with at least wearing the Georgia uniform. So that's maybe a name to at least think about for a moment. Wyatt Fielden says, and it's good to see Wyatt in the comment section. I feel like I haven't seen a Wyatt Fielden comment in a while. Maybe I've just been missing them. He says, Georgia baseball winning the SEC championship this year, and we have a great chance to win the national championship. We also have a chance to win the SEC championship in football and to win a national championship, and football will be awesome. I think that's exactly right. And I think when you are in the Athens area or kind of near that, you do get a better sense of the positive vibe it's given off when one of the other teams is doing well. Georgia football reverberates through the entirety of the state. It doesn't matter where you live, you're going to feel that. You get 3 hours from Athens, 2.5 hours from Athens, all of a sudden it's hard to feel much of a vibe around the baseball team or the basketball team because a lot of the people who attend those games are people who live in Athens. That's the one thing that makes baseball and basketball and softball and gymnastics, things like that, a little bit different, is that the overwhelming majority, I'm assuming, of the crowd for those games are Athens residents. So the vibe for that's felt within the Classic City. But having been in Athens a good bit during this baseball season, I can tell you there's a lot of fun about that. These games have been sold out. Every SEC game this year, I believe, has been sold out. That's a pretty big deal. It's not a huge stadium, of course, but it's a big deal to have as much fan attention and crowd reaction as Georgia's got. I think it's been great to see, and I hope to see it continue. And I do think that rising tides just lift all ships, and right now the Georgia athletic tide seems to be rising. Robert Barnes says, we need defensive line depth this year, and it'll be here this fall. Yeah, those freshmen coming in, to the extent that you count on freshmen along the defensive line, I think that's a tough spot for freshmen. But to the extent that you count on freshmen, they'll be able to provide some of that. It actually may be, even though Trayvon Walker's the most talented of all those incoming freshmen, it might be a guy like Mitchell who makes the biggest immediate impact because he's already really, really big, and he can occupy blockers and be a force to be reckoned with in the middle of a defense as kind of a reserve nose guard. I think that's something that Georgia could use. Marcinio Askew says, don't forget the recent recruiting success in basketball. Yeah, Marcinio, we just talked about that a good bit ago. I think that Tom Crean's doing a really good job in that regard right now. I'd also like to talk to you more about the Georgia-Oklahoma series if you want to do that. I think it was a lot of fun to see that series added. I'd love to get your thoughts on that and kind of, what you think about it. As I said before, there is a way to look at this as, why is Georgia getting all these home games later than it's getting its away games? Is this bad negotiating? Is this Georgia making some sort of mistake? Is this Georgia being too desperate? Is there still a problem, as I know Chip Towers wrote about with Sanford Stadium, scheduling future home games for Georgia? Is that being sufficiently addressed? And those are all fair questions and fair to talk about. I think my own personal spin on this, not because it has to be positive, but I think I do just genuinely see this as a little bit more positive, that the future of tougher Georgia schedules is essentially here. As I said before, it's Virginia next year. Virginia's not a great team, but it's better than playing, I don't know, Austin Peay or somebody like that. No big game in 2021, but then starting in 2022, every year for the foreseeable future, Georgia's got that extra non-conference game in addition to Georgia Tech. I think that's just a very interesting thing to think about. And I will also add to this that even though Florida doesn't come up in this discussion, when you look at the challenges of how you schedule these games, the need for home games, and the fact that I guess Georgia in the 2023 year may only be stuck with those 6 home games. Boy, I think the future of Georgia, Florida, and Jacksonville gets tougher and tougher to maintain. And I'm a fan of the cocktail party. I like that. I don't want to hijack this conversation with should Georgia, Florida be in Jacksonville. We've done that plenty, and we'll do that plenty more in the future. But when you see the current landscape of all of this, I just think given the nimble nature of being able to schedule these home and home with non-conference games, knowing that you have a neutral site conference game every year, which subtracts a home game from your docket every other year, I think the future of that becomes harder to justify. I like it in Jacksonville. I want it to stay there. But we could see these massive changes happening in college football that Georgia right now is at the center of. We could see Georgia, Florida be a casualty of this. I really believe that. And I think that secretly that's probably what Kirby Smart wants anyway. But that is, I think, something to really pay close attention to.
Do you think Oklahoma and Texas fans are having that same conversation about the Texas-Oklahoma game being in Dallas every year? Because Texas and Oklahoma are also doing this aggressive scheduling as well.
That's a really good question. I honestly don't know.
I mean, from what I know, it certainly doesn't sound like.
So let me tell you why I think it may not be, and why Georgia's situation might be different, is because you can play Texas and Oklahoma and Dallas every single year and still get your 7 home games every single year, because unless I'm misremembering, there's no non-conference yearly obligation there as well. Because the issue that Georgia runs into is in years where it's playing at Georgia Tech and also playing at Jacksonville, that's where it becomes harder to get the extra home game. So for Texas and Oklahoma, before the big-time, more aggressive scheduling, I'm not sure how that's going to change that scenario.
I mean, Oklahoma's been doing that, though. They played at Ohio State last year. They played in Houston a few years ago against Houston. I mean, Oklahoma has been doing it. Texas is going to play LSU this year.
Right, but when Oklahoma does that, that becomes the game that occupies the Tech spot on their schedule.
But they also have an extra conference game. The Big 12 plays 9 conference games.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. The honest truth is, I'm not sure what to say about that.
I am decidedly pro Jacksonville. So
I mean, that for the most part, I am there as well.
I just, for those that want to, move it out of there, you don't see Texas and Oklahoma fans having the same sort of bickerment about, what should we do with this rivalry game. They're all theoretically in the same boat as Texas, Oklahoma, Florida, Georgia are all in the same sort of boat.
Well, along those same lines, do you hear Oklahoma fans, I obviously not on Oklahoma message boards on a regular basis, do you hear Oklahoma fans saying, why don't we play Texas in Dallas every single year? Now, I'm not sure how far Austin is from Dallas. I think it's about 2.5-hour drive if I'm not mistaken. So that's probably a little farther than Gainesville is from Jacksonville. I could be wrong about that as well. So I guess the other question would be, do Oklahoma fans get frustrated about going to Dallas to play this game every single year? But it's a fair point to bring up that for whatever reason, you don't seem to hear the same level of bickering, and I think bickering is a good word to use. You don't seem to hear the same level of bickering about that. And yet, when it comes to the Georgia-Florida thing, even if objectively it doesn't have to be true, I get the feeling this may be on a little bit of life support, and no one has maybe noticed it yet, or maybe quietly it's being pushed and talked about. I just have a very strong curiosity of, will Georgia-Florida and Jacksonville, a game that I hope to see preserved, but will Georgia-Florida and Jacksonville be able to survive this new era of college football scheduling?
We're going to find out in the next probably 2 years, I would say, because that contract does expire after the 2021 season.
Yeah.
So I would say maybe about a year from now, we're hearing and figuring out, all right, is this going to remain in Jacksonville for the foreseeable future?
And it could be one of those things. I'm not quite sure how much Georgia and North Florida make off this game from a decision to play the game their standpoint, but it could be one of those things where Jacksonville, who is trying to reinvigorate its entire downtown scene, they're tearing down the Jacksonville Landing, as we've talked about before. They're going to try to repopulate that with something that looks a little better, I guess. It could be that they're forced to pony up in a big way to keep the game, and then financially, it's the kind of thing where at that point it's hard for Georgia and North Florida to say no to it. I personally kind of suspect, and this is all just complete speculation, that if Kirby Smart wanted the game out of Jacksonville right now, I don't quite think he's been able to establish enough power to be able to do that. The game has been at Georgia tradition for a long time. It may not be one of those things where a fourth-year head coach could get his way on this as of yet. But if Smart starts winning national championships and he truly wants that date every other year for recruiting, he may have the power to do that. And from a convenience standpoint, it may make a little bit more sense there as well. Chime Dog weighing in on the subject of interior defensive line. That comes up a lot, obviously. He says, it's a source of concern for me. Got to get way better. He says, I think if they do, Georgia wins the national championship. I certainly agree with you of one of these questions about why Georgia might not win the national championship. How good you can be on the interior of your defensive line is one of those important questions to answer along the way towards that. As much as we've talked about more havoc plays, more tackles for loss and sacks and things of that nature, Georgia, statistically speaking, was not great stopping the run a year ago. That's something that's got to be improved. I think that's a good point. Tram Dickerson on the subject of a tired defense with Jalen Hurts there late at the end of the game. And I think that obviously it's kind of sour grapes crying over spilled milk, whatever tired cliche you want to use. But when Georgia lost DeAndre Walker late in that game, there was also kind of that hurt Georgia late in that game. Tua leaving for Alabama ends up being the headline, but I believe it's that same play that Tua leaves that DeAndre Walker's never seen again either. And it was a big loss for Georgia in that game. Georgia Peach says, BA, get out of here with that crazy talk. We winning. Glad to see Georgia Peach chiming in on that. I'm not sure what my crazy talk was, but listen, there's probably plenty of crazy talk on a given show. Enrique Murillo weighing in also to say we have to improve. I think it's on the defensive line. He says, but I don't think it's going to be a source of concern. We finally have depth in that area, and we'll benefit from that. So good conversation going over here in YouTube. VTW says, keep the game in Jacksonville. If it's a one-person, one vote, I'm voting for Jacksonville. I am. And I'm guessing that I think I'd be very interested to see that if you could really, put this thing out to a ballot and give people a chance to really weigh in. Because the majority of people who watch the Georgia-Florida game, remember, don't watch it from the stadium in Jacksonville. They watch it on TV. So there's a huge pocket of people that don't really care where the game's played because they're going to be watching on TV no matter what. So I'm curious, if you had, Georgia fans vote on this, would keeping the game in Jacksonville be the majority opinion? I'm not exactly sure anymore. Not exactly sure. Tina Hedgewood said, Bulldogs and Gators need to be played in their hometown. Jacksonville, Florida is not neutral ground. Change this. Florida reaps the benefit of the money. Yeah, I think Georgia has reaped plenty of benefit in Jacksonville for a long time. I mean, don't forget, Jacksonville is a hot pocket for UGA graduates. And for South Georgia dogs, Jacksonville is essentially a lot closer for them. There's that popular phrase as of late, Jacksonville, Georgia. that's kind of been thrown around. So a lot of folks don't quite think this is a neutral site favoring Florida as much as they used to. Rashid Rajan says we still need that feared player on defense. That's that one every offense has to plan for. Yeah, I wonder who that's going to end up being for Georgia this season. I think there's a chance that at least in some version, Nolan Smith becomes that guy because I just think he's going to be a really, really impressive pass rusher. Now, he may have some issues from time to time with a missed tackle and run defense or something along those lines, but certainly as a guy that can potentially get past an offensive tackle and get to a quarterback, Nolan Smith may have a really good chance of doing that. Philip Jordan Wells says moving the game from Jacksonville would create a great schism within the fan base. Yeah, listen, I think that would definitely be a hotly debated topic with people probably feeling strongly about it on both sides. Steve Bond says the week's worth of build-up to the game in the RV City makes it a great atmosphere. Yeah, it's still really, really fun in Jacksonville if you're in the RV City area. If you're St. Simon's, places like that, where it's obviously been historically Georgia fans just loading up in these condominiums. It is a unique situation. And for my money, I'm obviously biased, but, Connor brought up the Oklahoma-Texas thing before. State Fair, I know it's going to have a cool atmosphere for that, but I don't think anything compares to being at the beach in October. And that's just a great, great experience. Willie Gray Jr. says, BA, is Florida catching us for the Fulmer Cup this year? I did see where Florida had, I believe his name is Brian Edwards. He's a defensive back that's mostly played on special teams. I saw where he was recently arrested on something. They've had a couple issues with that as of late, I guess, including a staffer as well. So not a great offseason for Florida, although this may be a glass houses situation for UGA. Gary Holt says the state of Florida is making a lot of money on this game for years. Georgia's also made a lot of money on this game as well. I mean, after all, Georgia's paid to be there. So Georgia's made plenty of money on this too. And listen, a lot of those Jacksonville business owners are Georgia fans. Jimmy Durham says, I wonder who steps up on the defense to lead that side of the team mentally. We need a man who commands respect when a play breaks down and reset the defense. So I think, based on my conversations with Georgia players, I don't think there's anybody more equipped to be a vocal leader on this team right now than the safety J.R. Reed is. I think that he really occupies that role for Georgia. I think Eric Stokes could potentially have some of that too, but Reed kind of wears that crown coming into the season, and others are obviously going to need to emerge. But right now, I feel really good about J.R. Reed in that. I don't know Monty Rice's personality quite as well because you'd obviously like to have one of those interior linebackers be able to do that too. And a lot of the linebackers that Georgia's going to use are going to be young guys. Kobe Dean, at this point in time, seems to look like he's going to be on the field a pretty good bit. I'm still high hopes for Channing Tindall and guys like that, maybe Quay Walker too. You need one of those veteran linebackers to hopefully occupy that role. I don't know how comfortable Monty Rice is doing that. He may be very comfortable. I just don't know. The same with Tay Crowder, who's been through a lot, seen a lot at Georgia. You would hope that one of those linebackers can kind of do that because you think sometimes of that linebacker as being one of your coaches on the field. So I would feel pretty good about that. But there are two guys I have no doubt are going to be big-time talkers for this team this year and really rallying points. I think that Reed is almost for certainly going to be one of those. And I could see Eric Stokes being really good at that too. Robert Barnes also mentions Richard LeCount in that regard. Yeah, the one thing we know about LeCount was he was a vocal leader as a part of the 2017 class. He was, with all due respect to Jake, I think LeCount may have been a bigger and better Pied Piper for that team than Jake was. Jake was really, really good, but I think LeCount was just a special level of magnetic personality that guys just wanted to be around and be a part of. So he's done that. And now doing that as an on-field leader, I think that'd be good to see. You got to be a good player to be a big leader in football. I think that makes football different than other sports. But as we said yesterday, there's a chance that LeCount was playing better last season than some people realize. And maybe there's more of that to come. Amos Williams also mentioning Otis Reese as a potential feared player. And I think that Reese is going to be heard from this year. For sure. Adrian Carver and the subject of unsubstantiated rumors. Yeah, that's kind of the way those things work. Typically, they just sort of fizzle into nothing over the course of time. That's one of the reasons why you got to be careful with stuff like that. Willie Gray mentions Nolan Smith, saying, I think he has a leader mentality to him as well. I think that's probably true. He's certainly a very articulate young man. He seemed to be joking around with everyone at the Army All-American game. He always kind of reminds me of, and I'm going to really date myself with this reference, but y'all know like the Rat Pack, like the Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr. thing? Nolan Smith kind of always seemed to have kind of a Rat Pack thing going on. Like at one point in time, Legend Cavazos was kind of in that. Cavazos, didn't he recommit to Ohio State? Is he going back there again? I forget where Cavazos is going, but he's one of those guys that seem to always have a pretty good collection of friends around him, and so in terms of being a leader, I think that Nolan's going to have that magnetism to his personality that gives him a chance to do that too.
You think of Georgia's freshmen, do you think Nolan Smith has the best season?
Ooh.
Incoming freshman 2019 class.
On both sides of the ball?
Both sides of the ball.
I mean,
I'm not looking for facts. I want your opinion. I want your take on this on May 7th, 2019.
I think it's probably a little easier for a freshman wide receiver to step in with a junior quarterback behind a big offensive line. I think that's probably easier. So if you're asking me the best freshman on this team, I'm going to assume it's one of the two receivers, George Pickens or Dominic Blaylock, just simply because they step into a ready-made situation. Nolan Smith is kind of to use a labored metaphor here, he's in kind of more of a startup situation on the defensive side of the ball because he's stepping into a spot outside linebacker where Georgia did not produce and so has not produced the last couple of years. He may very well add a lot of production to that in the terms of sacks and tackles for loss and everything else, but just based on what's already in place, that's a harder job. So Nolan may have a really good year and may go on to have a very good career at Georgia, but if I'm having to bet on one of these freshmen, I'm betting on Blaylock, I'm betting on Pickens because I just think that when you look at everything else being in place, stepping in as the final component to an offense, it's just an easier job. It's just easier to do well in that respect.
Right. Cliff Payne on YouTube, he throws out Nakobe Dean. I think he's certainly another candidate worth mentioning. I think the issue with Dean is maybe the competition at linebacker, it's pretty stiff. You have established guys, and you still also have, young talented guys in Channing Tindall and Quay Walker on the roster as well, whereas, at wide receiver, other than Jeremiah Holloman, there aren't a lot of really proven options, proven pass catchers on that side of the ball.
As far as the Cliff Payne's point about Nakobe Dean goes, we could be very well on the way to that. So far, Dean has exceeded – I had prodigious expectations for Dean, but thus far he's exceeded those. So we could very well be on our way to doing that. I still think inside linebacker as a freshman is just a really hard position to play. It just could be that Dean is just so good that he's going to be doing it. I still think of that as a really difficult position for a first-year player to play. So I don't know. I think that's a tough thing to do, but Dean may very well do it.
Philip Jordan-Well is throwing out a sleeper bet. I like this. Kenny McIntosh.
That's interesting. I think it's going to be hard to get carries at the running back position, though. I think I'm
glad
to see another name mentioned, but I think it's going to be hard to get that.
As we say that, we've seen years in the past. 2013 comes to mind where, you didn't think J.J. Green or Brandon Douglas were really going to factor into the running back rotation, but it's just because of the natural injuries that occur at that position, they both ended up having to do so. So it's while I certainly understand your point, I also don't think it's out of the realm of possibility where, we do see Kenny McIntosh getting a few carries this year as a freshman.
Enrique Murillo, back on the subject of the linebacker, says, I mentioned Monty Rice. He says, Rice going to have a big year. He showed lots of improvement his junior year. Look for him to step it up a bit of senior year. Listen, I got no beef with Monty Rice when he's on the field and playing. I think he's terrific at what Georgia needs, which is a good run-stopping linebacker. I think Monty Rice is really good at that. I think that's a really important thing to have. And I do think it's fun, even on a very deep and talented roster like Georgia, that we can list off all these potential freshmen who could be big impact guys. As I've said before, it's a different conversation in 2019 than it was in 2017 or 2018, where I think you looked at situations where if you didn't have a freshman perform, you might not have what you need to be really good. Now, maybe pass rush is that. Maybe pass rush is one of those things because Georgia statistically was so low on those charts a year ago that if you don't have newcomer Jermaine Johnson, true freshman Nolan Smith, if you don't have them stepping up and playing, maybe that's your only way of getting as many sacks as you want to get, need to get, to really be a real top-shelf defense. But other than that, almost every other freshman that you could potentially discuss would be a luxury more so than a necessity. Even the two receivers that I love, there's a way of saying that the guys who are already here, you could cobble together a pretty good wide receiver core from just that group. Even Blaylock and Pickens may be a bit of luxury items themselves. This is just a different kind of Georgia roster in that regard.
Tram Dickerson on YouTube and a couple other people are throwing out their Zeus. For the sake of this discussion, I'm just going to limit this to 2019 signees. I know he is technically a redshirt freshman.
And if he does well, he'll be a freshman All-American because last year Isaiah Wilson made freshman All-American team as a redshirt.
This is one of those things where this joke may go over your head, but at Georgia, you have those overachievers as freshmen who come in with something like 25, 30 credit hours in their second semester of their freshman year. They're already saying, well, according to DegreeWorks, I'm a sophomore, and then people just say, no, you're still a freshman. In this case, it actually is that. While he is technically a freshman, we're not really considering him in this discussion.
Amos Williams says, if Monty Rice was healthy for that SEC championship game, we would be national champions right now. And I certainly think there's a chance that's true. I do. I just think there's obviously a chance it's not true. But I do think Monty Rice's absence from that SEC championship game, and every game's going to have injuries, and every season's going to have what-if scenarios. Georgia's not unique in that regard. I totally acknowledge that. Monty Rice's absence from the SEC championship game is almost as significant as Amos describes it as. Almost as significant.
I want to say yes. And maybe this year, we'll look back and say, wow, that really was a significant injury. But with the way Alabama won that game, specifically with, Jalen Hurts late in the game scrambling around, finding time, I don't know how much Monty Rice really would have factored in those portions of the game. Because Alabama did not run the ball very well that day, from what I can remember. I'm sure people will pull up stats and say, they ran for X amount of yards. But, being there on the field, Alabama, it wasn't like the year before where, Najee Harris was ripping off some big runs in the second half. It wasn't really Alabama physically dominated the line of scrimmage in that game. It was more the side-to-side athleticism of Jalen Hurts that really allowed them to win the game.
Now, when you talk about jokes going over people's head, people not getting them, would people have gotten the joke if I just put like a Starbucks cup? Let me try to see if I can speak English. If I had put a Starbucks cup on the table for the show today, would people have gotten that joke?
I think a few would have, but you'll be apparently HBO has already edited the coffee cup out of the scene.
So for those of you who are not aware, and I promise this will be just a few seconds, but I am kind of curious to hear your thought on this. So on the most recent episode of Game of Thrones, a Starbucks cup was seen during the scene. Now, I wasn't watching the episode. I only saw this from social media. Mm-hmm. How do you think that escaped through all? I mean, I can only imagine, and part of the reason why I bring this up is because here on DawgNation Daily from time to time, we'll make an error about something. It's usually my error. It's almost always my error. And you guys got to understand something. I'm very hard on myself behind the scenes. Any kind of mess up or flub, I'm just really disappointed. I don't know. I guess drive myself crazy in that regard, but I don't like making mistakes, and I just feel inconsolable when there's a big error of some kind on DawgNation Daily. To know that a Starbucks cup made its way through the litany and army of people that are doing watch-behinds and back editing on a Game of Thrones episode, how do you think that happened? Is it intentional? Was this a wink and a nod of some kind?
I do think it was just something that was missed. Again, they have so much footage to look through. It is kind of small and inaccurate, and they were looking for it. And so in the actual scene that they're doing there, while the people that are talking off to the side when they flash to Danny, the showrunners themselves, D.B. Weiss and David Benioff, are talking to Tormund Giantsbane. So it's probably just oh, hey, let's make sure everything looks okay with us, and they just happen to forget the coffee cup on the right in front of Daenerys. But I will say, this is a 30-second Thrones take. Some of the Twitter discourse or discussion about Thrones is really it's annoying. I'm trying to enjoy the season. I've enjoyed the first 4 episodes. But the way it's dissected down to a molecular level, it's taking some of the fun out of the show. And, looking back at past great shows, I know you're a big fan of Mad Men and The Sopranos. If people were dissecting those final episodes down to their nuts and bolts, I mean, it would have driven everyone crazy, There's something to be said about, just sitting back and enjoy, and we do this more than anyone, with Georgia sports. There's something to be said about just sitting back and enjoying the product on the field and what you're watching.
I agree. I think I take the same attitude towards Georgia. There'd be a very easy way to kind of come in here and find something to tweak about every single subject. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, I just kind of hope that my default position is enjoying things, right? I mean, when you look at the future Georgia schedules, I think that sounds really fun. And my default position, more likely yes than no, is to say, hey, this is going to be kind of a good thing. And I think there's a way to kind of approach all of life that way. Steve Schaffini says somewhere on the subject of the Starbucks thing, an on-set dresser got screamed at. That may be very well true. I also think this is probably true as well. You ever have that moment where you've been working really hard on something and you kind of find something wrong with it past the point of doing anything about it? You'd have to scrap the entire episode to kind of go back and clean it up after the fact. And I think that's probably, if I had to guess, something that was probably more likely than not what happened there, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about. Chris Branham says social media has turned everybody into an expert and a critic. And I do think that the conversation that exists on social media about stuff like this is way different than the conversation that just exists in real life, where people probably are a little bit more predisposed just to enjoy things.
Yep.
BTW on the subject, Dennis Wilson, I guess, brought up Miami again. He says, Georgia will whip Miami, stop living off other programs. Yeah, of all these kind of major programs we've seen Georgia rumored to play or might play, Miami's the one that has not really come up. Now, partially that was due to the fact that recently Rick was the head coach there, but I don't really have Coral Gables on my list of must-see locations for Georgia to travel to, and that's not a shot at Dennis on this. That's really not. But when I think of the home-and-home, big non-conference series that Georgia has to play, Miami's not really one of those for me. It would be a Michigan. It'd be an Ohio State. It'd be the traditional powers for me well before it'd be, a program like Miami. That's not something I have a whole lot of concern to see Georgia go and do. How would you feel about that, Connor? You want to go see Georgia play Miami?
I think like you said, Michigan's probably a little bit higher on the list. Maybe an Ohio State down the line. Virginia Tech, I think, would be cool. And then you start looking at places out west. Maybe Oregon, up in Autzen Stadium, and then Seattle as well. I think those would be kind of cool locales to go visit. As far as Miami and Dennis Wilson, who he likes to chirp a lot in our comment section. Dennis, you better hope that Miami beats Florida.
I know it, Dennis.
If Miami doesn't beat Florida, that Monday coming in, we're going to do our regular show because it'll be a big week, Georgia's opening week. But boy, Dennis, you better hope that Miami somehow beats Florida.
Yeah, for those of you who are on Facebook right now and don't know, there's a guy named Dennis on the YouTube comment section who's a huge Miami fan. And honestly, we have figured out a way to coexist and get along. Dennis is always chiding Georgia fans about every little thing. The least you could do, your tax for being a part of this program, Miami has got to go to Orlando and beat Florida. It's a winnable game. Manny Diaz is trying to build up his program. I know there's some look-ahead lines of this game right now. I'm guessing Florida's probably about a touchdown to 7-8 point favorite, somewhere along those lines. Probably not a double-digit favorite, I'm not guessing. That's a winnable game for Miami. The least you could do is go to Orlando and win that game. Dan Mullins talked trash, saying it's a Florida home game. From a ticket sales perspective, that certainly seems to be the case. I feel like if you're Dennis Wilson in Miami, you got to win that game. You got to win that game.
Have to win. Boy, you don't want to see me on I guess August 26th would be that Monday. You don't want to see me on August 26th, Dennis.
Yeah,
if Miami loses that game.
No doubt about that.
And I mean, like you said, I don't think they're going to be favored in that game.
Brandon Vernon says Georgia would definitely take over that stadium. That's probably true. I guess when Georgia plays a game in Miami, I want it to be the Orange Bowl. I want it to be a major bowl game. Shades of 43 the last time Georgia was in the Orange Bowl. Is that right or not right? Yeah. Scott Harris says my ex-in-laws are all Sooners fans. We have to beat them again. I said this off the top of the program. I think it's kind of true. I think by the time you get to 2023, I think that Georgia-Oklahoma could feel a bit more like a rivalry. There's a little bit of a chapter now between these two programs. Georgia beat Oklahoma head-to-head at the end of the 2017 season. Oklahoma got in over Georgia at the end of the 2018 season. Assuming Riley stays in Norman, assuming Kirby stays in Athens, no reason to think Kirby's going anywhere. Lincoln Riley could have NFL aspirations. I don't know. They hire a lot of these offensive-minded Big 12-style coaches these days. But this clash of styles between the two coaches, the offensive-minded Riley, the defensive-minded Smart, I feel like that in addition to having ex-in-laws on the other side, I kind of feel like Georgia-Oklahoma could feel a little bit like a rivalry in 2023. They are programs who are just different enough, but seemingly in competition for the same thing. A lot can change in, half dozen years or whatever it's going to be, 4 or 5 years. But I feel like this could feel a little bit like a rivalry. Connor, how do you feel about that?
So I certainly see your point. They're, and we've talked a lot about the potential for a Georgia-Clemson rivalry as well. I think they're going to have to play.
Now, if you're a child of the 80s, Georgia Clemson is a rival.
Yeah, Georgia Clemson, there is a significant history there. Clemson and Georgia have played more than Tennessee and Georgia have. For it to really, sort of pick up, they're going to have to play a few times.
Yeah.
And I think both sides are going to have to get some key wins. You're going to have to see Oklahoma, maybe snatch a national title away from Georgia. God, I hope that doesn't happen. But, I think for it to go sort of that direction, you're going to have some more epic tilts like we saw in the 2018 Rose Bowl.
Well, the other thing to keep in mind here, too, is you're starting to see a little more overlap between these two programs in recruiting. Now, this wasn't a huge impact for Georgia, but when Georgia got Jay Hayes to leave Notre Dame, don't forget, Hayes at the time was an Oklahoma commit.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a lot of Oklahoma fans who were not happy about that because in Big 12 country, there's just not as much flipping of commits that goes on. So when Georgia flipped Hayes from Oklahoma upon leaving Notre Dame, a lot of Oklahoma fans didn't like that. Let's face it, a lot of Georgia fans don't like the fact that Jaden Hazelwood is leaving the state of Georgia to go play for Oklahoma. In 2023, if I'm doing the math correctly, that'll be the first year after the Hazelwood eligibility expires. He may leave after a junior. He may not make it 4 years. He may have transferred to Georgia by then. But so a lot could happen. But
could be suiting. He might be suiting up for Georgia in that game
after taking a red shirt. Yeah.
After taking a red shirt.
Yeah. Now that's a story. That's a story. But the point is that's at least two examples in recent years of there being a little bit of a Georgia-Oklahoma overlap. At least two examples of that, and over the course of the next couple of years, you could have a little bit more as well. So you've got both these programs that right now, if you said who are the programs vying to be the team right behind Alabama and Clemson, because no one to deny right now those are the top two teams. I mean, it really is Georgia and Oklahoma who kind of have that going on, and I'm guessing for at least the next couple of years that's going to continue. Now, a lot can change before 2023, but in terms of being a part of the playoff conversation together, that doesn't seem to be going out of style anytime soon. Likely be a few more recruiting battles to go on between these two teams. So these programs did not have a lot of history together prior to 2017, but by the next time these two teams are at least scheduled to play, I'm guessing there is a lot more history in place between them.
Yes, Oklahoma did in a more technical sense keep UGA out of the playoff last year. Though I would argue Georgia losing to Alabama is what kept them out. Another thing to maybe not something that could happen that I see actually happening that would potentially prevent this Georgia-Oklahoma rivalry sort of getting off the ground. And your point, the whole Lincoln Riley Kirby Smart debate. I think Lincoln Riley's days in Norman are not long. I think sooner rather than later, the Dallas Cowboys are going to back up several Brinks trucks to his residency, and they're going to make him the next coach of the Dallas Cowboys after Jason Garrett flames out.
And that could very well happen. If that be the case, then this entire rivalry, so to speak, series that's scheduled will have a very different feel if that takes place. Jacob Thompson makes an interesting statement. He says that Hazelwood made a mistake. Several UGA wide receivers in the NFL. And Oklahoma has one in the NFL, and he's on a practice squad.
They did just have a wide receiver taken in the first round in the NFL.
That's certainly true. I mentioned J.J. Holloman a little earlier in the show. That what if Holloman did become a first-round pick? That would be another in what I think is a series of pretty obvious cases of Kirby Smart developing a player under his watch at Georgia. Holloman was a 4-star recruit coming out of high school, but not a 5-star and not a, by anybody's mind, surefire star at the college level. Now, he was a well-regarded prospect, don't get me wrong, but Holloman would not have been in the category of can't-miss prospects, yet last season really emerged. What if it's the next step this season? What if he does become a high draft pick? I think that goes along with McCole Hardman, who was trained up to be a receiver during his time at Georgia. And, you can say Riley Ridley was already a top, receiver prospect. That's probably true. That probably doesn't count in there in that regard. But DeAndre Baker, the defensive side of the ball, would probably be an example of that. You have a couple things potentially going on here if Holloman does blossom the way that some think that he could. It is another example of not exactly can't-miss prospects becoming big-time. At the wide receiver position in particular, one of those potential knocks on Kirby and his regime as coaches, all of a sudden that's kind of cleaned up, and Georgia can say, hey, we've done as well at producing wide receivers as anybody has.
Right. It should be noted they did technically have 3 guys drafted this year. Riley Ridley I think had his pre-draft process gone a little bit better,
Yeah.
maybe he does end up being a round 2 selection. But
What do you think hurt him in the draft process? You follow the draft so much more closely than I do, but why did we hear Ridley as a potential first-round pick, and then at the very worst a second-round pick, and then he's finally drafted, was it the 4th round?
4th round, 126th overall pick.
What happened there? Was he never as good as people in the media thought he was? Was there a reconsideration of Ridley? Why did he end up getting drafted worse than people thought he was going to?
So a part of it is he did not have a ton of college production, and while I think last year, and certainly in big games against Georgia's best opponents, LSU, Alabama, Texas, he played very well in those games. The production is a concern. I think you factor in with the fact that he was never going to test well athletically, but he again, testing poorly as he did at the combine, and then not running for scouts again at Georgia's pro day. I think that made them a little bit wary of, his potential, because, again, a lot of this is just based on, especially as you get sort of later and later in the draft after those first 60 picks or so. It's, all right, so what do you do really well? And with him not really having anything that stands out athletically, I think that pushed him down draft boards a little bit. And, he is an incredible route runner, and he does a very, very good job of getting open. But it's hard to easily sell that as a translatable trait to the NFL, and I think that's why he fell a little bit. Now, he landed in a great spot with Chicago. There's not a ton of wide receiver depth there outside of Allen Robinson. I think that he's got certainly a chance to come in and play right away and sort of help that offense, and he actually, I think, Mecole Hardman landed in a dream spot for his talents, especially with what should happen with Tyreek Hill. But I think, it wouldn't surprise me at all if Riley Ridley has a solid season next year.
Yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting take. James Hightower in our Facebook comment section says, come on, BA. J.J. Holloman's already in full bloom. If you look at the stats, a little less than he had 500 yards receiving. He actually had 418 yards receiving for his season. But here are the numbers that matter the most to me. It's how many catches are you getting in Georgia's biggest games. At the beginning of the year, he was not a big part of the offense. Only had 1 catch against Austin Peay. Only had 1 catch against South Carolina. He popped a little bit against Middle Tennessee State. He got 3 catches. He was back to 1 catch against Missouri, although that was a big one, right? That was for a touchdown where he fumbled the football before going into the goal line. And then after that, you start to see a little more usage. He has 2 catches against Tennessee. He has 3 catches at LSU. And then in Georgia's 2 big November games where the season tide kind of turned, he had 4 catches against Florida, 4 catches against Kentucky. It's really those kinds of efforts that you want to see Holloman duplicate for entire season. If he's putting more of those kinds of games together for a full year, at that point in time, you're talking about kind of breaking out of that statistical ceiling that has seemed to exist for Georgia receivers. Remember, even in the year in 2017 where Javon Wims was seemingly all over the place, he barely eclipsed 700 yards that year. So 800 yards, 900 yards, those kinds of receiving totals for Georgia, we haven't seen a receiver get there in the Kirby Smart era. And Holloman, I think, has a chance to do that next year. Now, he's not the only receiver, I think, for Georgia that could do that. One of the newcomers coming in, I think, could be heavily used as well and put up some big numbers like that. But when I say coming into full blossom, that's what I'm talking about for Holloman, doing more of what he did against Kentucky and Florida. Now, the overall reception totals for those games, or I should say receiving yard totals for those games, not that great. Only had 39 yards receiving against Kentucky, 48 yards versus Florida. But it's the total number of catches that matter to me. 8 over the course of those 2 games that won the East for Georgia. 2 of those go for touchdowns against the Gators. It's really that 2-week span where J.J. Holloman, I think, showed you what he could be as a junior in 2019. He's just going to do that for an entire season. When we played the audio of Kirby talking about Holloman earlier in the show, he used the word consistency like 3 times. There's no doubt that he brings that to practice every single day, but finding a way to get that top-end level more consistent throughout a season, that's obviously the next step for Holloman.
Is there a number you have in mind that you'd like to see Holloman hit this year in terms of catches and yardage totals?
It's not for me because I don't necessarily need for it to be Holloman. I just need for it to be somebody. So if it's Holloman because he's been here, if it's Demetrius Robertson because, as the phrase that we used a lot on DN90 yesterday, because he's bought in, if it's George Pickens or Dominic Blaylock just because they're too good to keep a wrap on, I just need somebody to burst through and and even eclipse what Javon Wims did in 2017. If Georgia's a true national championship team, you have to add a tough-to-guard wide receiver into the collection of running backs, and Fromm as a seasoned passer as a junior. You've got to add that weapon of, here's the guy we're going to. We're going to use this guy to move the chains on third down. It's got to be somebody. Holloman may be the most likely answer for that. If it's not Holloman, it's somebody else. That's fine for me. But definitely because Holloman has taken the big step in 2018, him as one of your top 2, top 3 receivers, that for me is going to be plenty. Anything else before we go here? Anybody else anything they want to say? Over here on YouTube again.
You'd want to see Georgia throw the ball more next season than they did this past season, right?
I do. Yeah, I do. Half dozen times more per game, something along those lines. Not a whole lot more because Georgia's still going to be a really good running team. And the potential emergence of Zamir White maybe makes that even more true. But I do think national championship winners throw the ball more than Georgia does. I don't like being a team that says, I know everybody's doing this. We're going to try to win a national championship doing something different. I don't like outliers that much. I don't. I don't like being a statistical anomaly. And Georgia winning a national championship, throwing it as little as it's thrown it the last couple of years, would be that anomaly. And I do want that to change just a bit. Don't need for it to change a lot, but I need for it to change a little bit. Tram Dickerson says D-Rob made a statement recently. Yeah, we covered that yesterday as a part of DN90. I did see that. I thought it was good. And what else? Anybody else? Anybody here?
We're pushing up on close to 2 hours here.
Yeah, we probably should rock and roll. I do want to see you for DawgNation Days of Summer. I think that's going to be a ton of fun. We even got the reminder back here in the screen behind us. Just kind of changing things up a little bit for the summer. So go to DawgNation.com. You can find the link to reserve your room with June 13th at Callaway Resort and Gardens, August 1st at Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. Hope to see you for both those terrific events, and hope to see you back here again tomorrow for DawgNation Daily. Before I say goodbye, though, let me remind you that my friends at R.S. Andrews make the R.S. Andrews cool down possible. Air, heating, plumbing, electric. I'm talking about broken air conditioned, water heater, kind of everything else. They'll do it all for you. Find them online at rsandrews.com. Y'all have a great day. We'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow.